So, I wanted to make a video for fearful avoidance and anxious preoccupieds who tend to really struggle with chronic guilt. And I wanted to unpack a little bit about what's actually happening and what you can do to sort of shift your perspective on chronic guilt and also put yourself into a healthy space that's more likely to keep you thriving in relationships, be securely attached, because guilt can really create a lot of sabotaging patterns in relationships themselves. So, point number one is that when you are feeling really guilty about something, generally, if it's like, especially if you struggle with chronic guilt, like if you're struggling with guilt in general and you keep a guilt journal and you see all the times you guilt yourself for stuff throughout the day, one of the first things you'll see if you're actually struggling with chronic guilt, which is very typical for fearful avoidance and APs, one of the first things you'll see is that generally your story of whatever you feel guilty about is magnified. Okay. So, usually you'll see that if you feel guilty because someone in your life is going through this hard time and maybe you're guilting yourself thinking I'm not doing enough or I should be doing more. If you pay attention, your narrative, if you make it conscious and you really introspect about it, you'll see that your narrative about what somebody's going through is magnified. So let's say, for example, it's a friend going through a divorce. Okay. Your friend might be going through a challenging time and maybe you're guilting yourself for not doing enough, even though you might be really showing up because APs and FAs tend to really show up, but they still guilt themselves chronically. You might look and you might realize that your story of your friend is as if your friend is like, horribly, horribly depressed and just like lays on the bathroom floor all day crying and never gets up and is starving. And like you probably have this very magnified, dramatic vision or version of that person's story. And when you come into PDS, the big thing you see is that we question our stories while also being accountable for our needs. And we question the stories we have about ourselves. Like if somebody doesn't call me back, do I make it mean that I am unlovable, right? And we question some of those stories and we help equilibrate them. But under that same sort of umbrella, sometimes we have these fantasy stories about other people that are us guilting ourselves, right? It's like, hey, maybe you're calling your friend every day and you're checked in and you're doing your best, but maybe you see, if you look closely, that you've got this really dramatic story about that person's pain and suffering. And of course, that's going to trip you into more chronic guilt about the situation. So questioning the story, like, is my friend really suffering to the nth degree? Like, what is their day probably like? Maybe my friend has a good cry now and then, and maybe, she's going through a hard time, but I call regularly. She's got lots of friends and family and a good support system. So trying to equilibrate those stories you have about others is a very important first step. Second step, if you are struggling with chronic guilt, is that you generally as well, if you pay close attention, are making somebody's situation mean something about you as also. So you'll have this story about yourself, like, oh, I'm just not good enough. I'm not doing enough. Um, I'm being a bad person or a bad friend. And you have to question those stories too and see where you are coming from and what you are doing. It doesn't mean that if you're not doing something that that you shouldn't do more or be accountable or see where you can contribute or show up in a way that takes yourself and your boundaries into consideration. But it means that sometimes generally the people that are struggling with chronic guilt, they tend to be doing this like all the time. And whatever relationship they're in with whatever person it is, it's as if they're constantly in that person's perspective and not paying attention to their own. So this brings me to point number three, which is, are you seeing yourself and your own feelings, your own needs, your own boundaries as much as you are seeing those of others? And generally people who are struggling with chronic guilt tend to be, you might be sitting at work doing your work and then you're seeing your boss and you're thinking of how pressured your boss must feel and how hard that must be. And then you see one of your parents and you think of what they're going through and how hard that must be. And then you see a sibling and what they're going through, how hard that must be. And then a friend. And you're like seeing so deeply into everybody's perspectives and problems and feeling so much sympathy and or empathy for them, but you're like not rooted and grounded in your own feelings. And that can cause you to actually like really be enmeshed in a way that's a detriment to the relationship to yourself, like not making your own needs, your own habits, the things that fill your cup matter because you're so preoccupied with seeing everybody else way more than you're seeing yourself. And again, this will cause you to largely deprioritize yourself and put yourself at the end of the totem pole, which for short periods of time in urgent situations might serve, but for that to be your set point is going to lead to burnout in relationships, especially. So really paying attention to that component is always very, very valuable. Um, Another really important thing to do is when we are struggling with chronic guilt, and I have a whole course on this, by the way, you can check out for free. It's all about chronic guilt, but also chronic shame. There are two things that can keep people so stuck in their personal and professional lives. It helps you reprogram the patterns that lead to it at a subconscious level and really unpack them profoundly. And you can check it out for free for 7 days. And literally within 7 days, if you go through the course, you have more than enough information and time to get through that course. It's like an hour and a half of a course. And you'll get exactly the steps you need to break through these patterns, like to break through and not feel plagued and burdened by feeling this way all the time. And it will allow you to have a lot more freedom in your like mental, emotional space. Because when you're struggling with chronic guilt and shame, you don't often realize how much of your like personal, mental, emotional real estate is consumed by these things. So, it will help you free up some of that space that you can then put into creating or your goals or your dreams or your relationships in a healthy way, not from a place of guilt. So anyways, another really important thing to pay attention to is this idea that when you are guilting yourself, that sometimes there's something there for you to take accountability for, right? Maybe there's a conversation you need to have. Maybe there's something you need to address, and to ask yourself, how can I do that in the healthiest way possible that also takes my needs and my perception into account? So being able to take ownership if you did make a mistake, if you weren't calling that friend enough who's going through the divorce or whatever it might be, and say, hey, I apologize for this. Here's where I'm coming from. I'm here to show up a little bit more. So we can still be accountable. But the chronic guilters and shamers are usually taking over account for other people's lives and under account for their own personal lives and goals and dreams. So just an important thing to keep in mind for sure. And one other thing as well is sometimes when you're chronically guilting and shaming yourself, you're also in this place, especially with guilt, where you're seeing pain as like exclusively horrid. In other words, if we have an honest look at pain, pain sometimes serves. Sometimes when we go through the pain of, let's say, a divorce, or let's say the pain of losing a job, or the pain, it's not to take away from the fact that pain is not fun. And pain hurts, and it can be very uncomfortable and scary at times to go through different things like that. But pain also has the greatest capacity to grow us. It has the greatest capacity for us to start introspecting. Sometimes pain helps us release things that are not serving us any longer, right? Like maybe you lost a job because you weren't showing up because you hated the job, and now you've got space to go after the dream that you have for yourself. So sometimes when we're stuck in this chronic guilt cycle with so many people, it's because we're looking at pain as this really scary thing. And sometimes we have to actually shift and change our overly one-sided perception about pain. And see how, pain can feel uncomfortable, but sometimes pain can make us learn, grow, let go of things that are no longer serving. And sometimes writing out the benefits to pain. I know that sounds really crazy, but the benefits to pain, like if you look at painful times in your life and you look at what you learned, how you grew, what you were forced to let go of that no longer served, how that grew different aspects of your life. You formed new relationships, you went in a new direction, you had to introspect things about yourself. Like sometimes that can be so powerful. So many people come into PDS because they're going through a rough breakup, and they come in to get healing and learning and growth around their attachment style. And then they're in for a couple months and they're like, oh, I'm dating somebody new. I understand relationships differently. And this relationship's way better than anything I was going through before. And so the breakup served, right? Like in a way, as uncomfortable as it was, it served. It helped them introspect about themselves, learn more deeply, and then find something even more meaningful and fitting for their lives. And so, when we look at pain shows us what's not working so we can take accountability for ourselves, for our lives, so we can introspect, pay attention to things we were missing. And so when we do that with understanding our perception of pain, but also our perception of other people's pain, other people's suffering, why that might be growing them in some way, and bring that more into balance, that can be a very valuable thing for letting go of chronic guilt as well. I just wanted to pop in here and let you know we are doing a 7-day free trial to the All Access Membership Pass at PDS, which means you get access to literally everything inside of the school. And this includes the 4 live webinars I do with our students every single week. And on top of that, you get access to all of our different courses. We have over 55 different courses on relationships, communication, boundaries, emotional mastery, guilt and shame, learning your needs, so many different facets that are really important to master our lives and feel really good about our lives going forward. And last but not least, there's a daily community event. We have trained facilitators and coaches who are in there doing that work, showing up to support you on your journey every single day. Please join me on the other side. Come check it out. See if it's a fit for you. I'd love to see you there. Go ahead and sign up by clicking the link in the description box below. So I hope that makes sense. We cover all of that stuff in the course, just in way more detail, along with some other things. If you struggle with it, it's worth downloading the worksheets, going into the workbook in the course, working through some of the exercises, because it'll just help you get results so much more quickly. But I hope this makes sense to you. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please consider subscribing. I put literally daily content out almost every day, I think, for the past 2, maybe 3 years. So lots of exciting things to learn on here about the subconscious mind, personal development, attachment styles, relationships, our emotions and emotional regulation. So would love if you joined our community. Thank you so much for watching.